Good morning. I'm well. I know we're a little late and sparse, but I thought I would get us started. My name is Kim Bowes. I'm the director of the American Academy, which is the institution you find yourself in today, in case you weren't aware of that. And we're delighted to welcome you all here for the conference Hybrid Republicanism in Italy and American Art, 1848 to 1918. I'd like to first thank the Terra Foundation for their support of this project and their support of other projects at the Academy, which we are thrilled and proud to be a part of. There are many institutions involved in this project whom I'd also like to thank: the Smithsonian Museum for American Art, the U.S. Embassy in Italy, Roma 3, Kenyon College, the Centro Studi Americani, Purchase College, the State University of New York, and I'd particularly like to thank my colleagues Lindsay Harris and Peter Miller for all the work that they've done on this conference, as well as Ann Coulson, who is not here, as many other people are not here because she is stuck on a bus in traffic. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and attending. Those of you who've come from afar from the US, apologies for the weather. We put in a request, it was ignored. It will be brightening up later today, though, so don't give up hope. And I'd like to put in a plug for the continuation of this conference in October of 2000. At the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. will be this conference in its second iteration, The Course of Empire, American Fascination with Classical and Renaissance Italy. So both earlier than the subject matter of this conference and later, 1760 to 1970. So this conference addresses this topic of republicanism and tyranny, or better, how heated discussions about ideology animated both Italian and American politics and art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I have just finished reading, now 10 years after it was published, Ron Chernow's wonderful biography of Alexander Hamilton, which I found a reassuring biography, namely because I learned that the subjects which American contemporary politics can't seem to get over, the appropriate role of the state, the longing for a rural utopia, the rhetoric of tyranny, this disputed definition of what constitutes a republic, have been with us, those of us who are Americans, since our 18th century founding. We're still arguing about exactly the same things. And I'm so pleased to learn at this conference the way in which Italy couldn't get over these issues either. So we are not alone. These are issues which were at play not only in politics, but also art production and art production in the service of politics. So, and I think, therefore, and one of the reasons we're so pleased to have this conference here is that it's not only a conference about a critical moment in nation building in both Italy and America, but a conference about themes and image making that stay with us still. So without further ado, I will pass the podium on to my colleague, Melissa Dubakis, who is from Kenyon College, whose support and stick-with-itness for this project we are so appreciative of, and we're so happy to have here today. Melissa.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of pick up a few more people as the rain subsides. I want to reiterate a lot of what Kim just said. It's my pleasure, to welcome you here to our conference, and to thank again the Terra Foundation for American Art, and for John Davis, who's here as their representative, has been extremely supportive of this project from its beginning, way back when. And then all the other institutions that have been helping us. And I want to really thank the Academy. They have been wonderful, so gracious, and so helpful with all this. And the Centro Studi Americani has been very, very wonderful in this. The Embassy of the United States of America in Italy, and of course the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And our home institutions also have helped a lot, Kenyon College and Purchase College at SUNY, State University of New York, but especially Università degli Studi Roma 3, where Daniele is from. They have brought a lot of support to this project. There are a lot of individuals that I'd like to thank, because this has been a long project. And the idea, I just want to go over briefly the chronology. The idea for the project was generated at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in January of 2014. And that's when I was in residence as the Terra Foundation Senior Fellow in American Art, and both Amelia Gurlitz and Karen Lemmy, who are here from SAM, were extremely supportive of this international endeavor, and they have worked tirelessly in Washington to bring this, to fruition. And I also want to thank my dear friend Paul Kaplan, who has been with me from the start with this project. We have talked about this for a lot of years, and we've just worked hard through thick and thin, good days and bad days, and we're here. We're here in Rome. And then in the spring of 2014, I think these dates are right, I met with Peter and Lindsay here in Rome to talk about this endeavor. And they really jumped on the idea of partnering with the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was thrilled to work with the Academy. The Academy was thrilled to work with the Smithsonian. So we sort of knew that we had something going here. And that same trip, I met with Daniele and Marina Cambone, who's here, and we talked about this project. And it was then that Daniele suggested that we bring the Centro in, and if they could participate. And then they became part of this international collaboration. And so I really want to thank Daniele, too. You are our tireless advocate here in Rome. You have worked so hard and had undying optimism about this project and helped us bring this to fruition. So we owe you an enormous debt. So last night, those of you who attended, there was a wonderful reception and keynote at the Centro, lovely meal, and Don, who's here, Don Doyle, gave a wonderful, fascinating talk, which opened the conference in a very stimulating manner, and thank you, Don, for coming and giving that wonderful talk. And then again, my thanks to the Academy, to Lindsay, to Ann Colson, who's still stuck on a bus somewhere, and Kim, for working with us and just being wonderful partners in all this. Let's see, so thanks to all our speakers. We look forward to hearing your talks, and to the staff at the Museum of the Roman Republic of 1849 in the Arco right up the street. I don't know, I'm pointing in the right direction, this direction. And we'll be getting a tour of the museum after the conference later. And then also, Kim mentioned our conference next year in Washington, which is last night. Yesterday we had a meeting, and so we're thinking about this. That's okay. The Course of Empires. And then I think we're going to tinker with the second half, American Fascination and with Classical and Renaissance Italy, 1760-1970, which will be held at the Smithsonian, at SAM, in Washington, October 20th to 21st. Paul will talk a little bit more about this, and you'll hear more about this as we get our publicity out. Thanks again for coming. It's wonderful to see you all here, and
well, very few words. Thank you, Melissa. Also because I spoke yesterday, so those who were there already heard my thanks to all the people who collaborated in making this possible. Of course, the American Academy today, which is in a way a sister organization with the Center for American Studies. They were born in those days, between the end of the 19th and early 20th century. So thank you, Melissa and Paul. It's wonderful to work with you. It's a very interesting and stimulating experience. And thank you, Kim, Lindsay, and Peter for your support also. And, well, everybody, I hope, I'm sorry, I apologize, as Kim did also, for the weather. We tried hard, despite we are so close to the Vatican, we didn't manage to get nice weather. The Pope didn't collaborate. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker of this session this morning. It's a colleague and a friend from Trieste, University of Trieste, Leonardo Bonomo, who's Associate Professor of Anglo-American Literature in the Department of the Humanities at the University of Trieste, and he holds a PhD from the University of California at San Diego. He has published extensively, actually, on these very subjects, immigration, ethnicity, and class in American writing, 1830 to 1860, a book that came out 2 years ago for Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, and Backward Glances, a book I loved, I must say, exploring Italy, reinterpreting America, 1831-1836, published in 1996. And actually also an essay that I'd like to quote, because I think it's right in the, on these topics, between America's Italy and Italy's America, transcending borders, an essay that came out in a book edited by Tamburi and Gardafei, Transcending Borders, Bridging Gaps, Italian Americana, Diasporic Studies, and the University Curriculum. So he's also a member of the Brit Book Award Committee that has been organized 2 years ago, started with the EU Embassy in Rome, and he's the founding member of the Italian American Studies Elder Foundation at the Bellagio Center in Italy. The title of his speech today, of his paper, is Past Glories, Present Miseries, Reading Italy Through Art in Catherine Maria Sedgwick's Letter from Abroad to Kindred at Home. Leonardo.
Right? Good. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Daniele, Melissa, Paul, Lindsay, Harris, and the American Academy, and all those who have contributed to this conference. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. Okay, then. Best known today for her historical novel, Hope Leslie, 1827. New Englander Catherine Mariah Sedgwick was the most highly regarded American woman writer of the first half of the 19th century. As Mary Kelly has noted, in her time, Sedgwick was recognized alongside Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and William Cullen Bryant as, quote, a founder of her nation's literature, unquote. Equally adept at mining her country's past for literary materials or portraying the contemporary scene, Sedgwick moved skillfully and freely between fiction and nonfiction. Consistently maintained a conservative view of marriage and motherhood as a woman's ultimate fulfillment. She herself chose not to marry and committed herself fully to her profession. Furthermore, she transgressed traditional gender boundaries between literary topics, delving into the supposedly masculine domains of history, politics, and economics, as well as into areas such as sentiment, domesticity, and piousness, widely believed to be the woman writer's special province. Deeply invested in the question of American cultural independence and the creation of a distinctively national literature, Sedgwick was also remarkably cosmopolitan in her tastes and interests, as testified in particular by her 1841 book, Letters from Abroad to Kindred at Home. Based on her European travels of 1839-1840, this book fits into the Anglo-American Grand Tour genre, with its route through well-known locations, its descriptions of historical and artistic landmarks, and its emphasis on the picturesque. But it also departs significantly from that tradition in its pronounced interest in contemporary social and political issues. Sedgwick's concern about the here and now is particularly evident in the second volume of the book, devoted almost entirely to Italy. Instead of focusing mostly on the past, as many British and American authors of books about Italy invariably did, Sedgwick used her observations about the country's history and glorious artistic heritage to throw into bold relief its present state of near paralysis and despondency, which she saw as the direct result of political oppression. while duly taking her readers on a guidebook-sanctioned visit to celebrate its cities, landscapes, and monuments, she also tried to make them aware of the effects of foreign occupation and despotism on contemporary Italy, and the special relevance of Italy's situation for Americans. Sedgwick chose to convey her observations in epistolary form, structuring the book as a series of travel letters nominally addressed to her brother Charles back home. But these published letters differ significantly from her surviving private correspondence with Charles and other members of her family, both in size, they are considerably longer, and content, favoring, as they do, descriptive passages over personal references. Evidence seems to suggest that they never existed in any other form, that they were not transcribed from actual letters. The published letters then constitute, in the words of Lucinda Damon Bach, quote, a literary strategy calculated to create a sense of intimacy between author and audience, unquote. Together with Charles, other relations, and friends of the family, all of Catherine's readers are the kindred at home, whom, as the book's title announces, she addresses from across the Atlantic. It seems to me that, particularly in the Italian section of the book, by far the longest, Sedgwick extends the meaning of kindred even further, so as to include, in general, her fellow Americans. She appeals to them as the citizens of a democracy born out of a revolution, and as such, a people capable of relating to and sympathizing with the Italians, then engaged in a struggle for independence and the achievement of nationhood. As a student of Italian language and culture, Sedgwick was certainly well equipped to read and interpret the Italian scene for her readers. In Antebellum America, an acquaintance with Italian idiom, accompanied by a fascination with things Italian, was not rare among cultivated upper and middle-class women, as evidenced, for example, by the fairly astounding number of Italy-related stories, sketches, poems, and pictures published in the popular magazine Godey's Lady's Book. But Sedgwick's interest in Italy went far beyond the narrow confines of what was regarded as a highly desirable accomplishment in a lady. In the 1830s, Sedgwick and her family welcomed to the United States, befriended, and provided essential assistance to some of Italy's most prominent patriots, who, originally condemned to death by the occupying Austrian government, had had their sentences commuted to exile after being confined for years in the notorious Spielberg prison. Of the Italian exiles, Sedgwick wrote the following, quote, several of them became intimate in my family and closely bound to it by reverence and affection on our side. Confalonieri, Foresti, Albinola, Castiglia became our dear friends, unquote. While Sedgwick was not alone in her sympathy for the Italian cause, it is fairly safe to say that no other American writers at the time became so actively involved or developed a relationship with the representatives of the Italian political diaspora. And only Margaret Fuller, after she took up residence in Italy as the correspondent for the New York Tribune in the late 1840s, gained a keener awareness and a deeper understanding of Italy's predicament in the Risorgimento era. The encounter with Italian exiles had a powerful impact on Sedgwick's opinions about national character, ethnicity, and religion. It forced her to question some of her beliefs, which, however more progressive and liberal than most, were certainly not immune from the Anglo-Saxonism and anti-Catholicism to which so many of her contemporaries in the United States heartily subscribed. What she saw in men such as Gaetano de Castiglia and Federico Confalonieri was a kind of moral purity, a clarity of opinion and conduct which matched her ideas of what an enlightened elite should possess. Her father, former US congressman and senator, and her brothers being her nearest point of reference. What she also recognized, however, was that those character traits, indeed the whole moral and intellectual makeup of the Italian exiles, was inextricably connected with upbringing, and faith. In a period when, especially in New England, anti-Catholic prejudice was rampant and occasionally led to violence, as in the 1834 burning of the Ursuline convent and school in Charlestown, Massachusetts. Sedgwick was confronted with living proof that intellectual lucidity, integrity, and the love of freedom were not incompatible with Catholicism. Remembering the Italian exiles in later years, she painted them as patterns of virtue, as heroic, as almost saint-like. The Castilla, whom she called an elected brother to us all, possessed, in her words, quote, all the virtues that one can name, and in their most attractive forms. He was a Catholic, such a Catholic as Fenelon was, as St. Paul was, clothed in the whole armor of God. But Castilla had more of St. John than St. Paul, and as appropriately might that apostle, who is to us the impersonation of all gospel love and gentleness, have been chained in a dungeon as Castilla, unquote. To Federico Confalonieri, Sedgwick erected a verbal monument celebrating him as, quote, a man that no circumstances can subdue, but whose spirit, like angelic spirits, makes all circumstances subservient to his progress. I have never seen any man who has realized to me my beau ideal, the dreams of my youth, and the same portrait of my maturity, unquote. Confalonieri and his fellow exiles were very much on Sedgwick's mind during her Italian travels. While touring the north, she visited scenes from which her Italian friends had been displaced, and witnessed almost on a daily basis the pervasive, stifling presence of the Austrian military. It was only natural that she should think of the exiles as part of her ideal readership, as honorary members of the kindred at home to whom she addressed her letters from abroad. But what makes Sedgwick's travel book unique is that her very trajectory in Italy reflects, to some extent, her close relationship with Italian exiles. While Sedgwick's European trip was a family affair, in that she traveled with her older brother Robert, his wife, an eldest daughter, and 2 other nieces, and the trip's primary purpose was to cure Robert, who had recently suffered a stroke, Sedgwick was also on a mission of sorts for the Italian exiles. In addition to being among the imagined addressees of her travel letters, they were themselves the authors of letters of introduction Sedgwick carried with her. Those letters gained her admission into the homes and won her the gratitude of the exiles' families and friends, of other former prisoners of Spielberg, most notably Silvio Pellico, and of other illustrious Italians such as Alessandro Manzoni. Sedgwick was then simultaneously the exiles' emissary and their representative. She carried news of them to their loved ones and at the same time evoked their presence and reputation in a travel book to sensitize her American readers to the cause of Italian independence. For clearly, it was of paramount importance to Sedgwick to convince her fellow Americans that the Italian people were worthy of self-rule. The Italian exiles she counted among her friends were the incarnation of that worthiness. This message, which runs like a red thread through the Italian section of Sedgwick's book, stood in sharp contrast to that infantilization and feminization of Italy and its people, which, as Bridget Bailey and Paola Gemme have shown, figured prominently in American portrayals, both literary and visual. In the same vein and with the same objective, Sedgwick examined the Italian past and contrasted it with the present. As we shall see, in her survey of Italian cities and landscapes, she singled out the era of the independent city-states as the most glorious chapter in Italian history. It was a precedent which showed what the Italians had been capable of when they were masters of their own destiny. It was also the model of government and society that, in her view, contemporary Italians were striving to recreate on a national scale. Similarly, Sedgwick was drawn to those artworks that, in addition to being superior aesthetic achievements, told foundational stories about the country where they had been created. Thus, in a travel book, celebrated masterpieces are made to testify in favor of the Italian people, to attest to their fitness to aspire to nationhood. This idiosyncratic and ideological reading of Italy sets Sedgwick's views apart from those one encounters in most previous and contemporary American travelogues, and looks forward to Margaret Fuller's politically engaged dispatches for the New York Tribune. Rather than a limitation, Sedgwick's lack of expertise in art history, which she acknowledged candidly, gave her license to assess the Italian scene by different standards from those traditionally prescribed and codified from a perspective textually marked as masculine, to use Elizabeth Ball's phrase. Her faulty education in art, for which she was chastised by the critic of the North American Review, allowed her to distance herself from the type of acquisitive, imperialist, and sexually charged gaze that countless Anglo-Saxon male travelers had directed at Southern Europe and in particular at Italy. While Sedgwick shared, like most American and British women travel writers of her time, the class status and accompanying privileges of her male counterparts, as a woman she was particularly sensitive to the lot of those who, like the Italians, or even more glaringly African Americans in the United States, had their liberty severely curtailed. This is not to suggest that Sedgwick's portrayal of Italy and its people is entirely free from tropes and commonplaces that by 1841 were firmly established. Like many of her predecessors, she occasionally depicts Italian life as a spectacle, a giant pageant in which history and art, the dead and the living, all contribute to the overall aesthetic effect for the benefit of foreign spectators. In particular, like most Protestant visitors, Sedgwick responded with a mixture of puzzlement and discomfort at what she perceived as the theatrical, performative quality of Catholic ritual. At the same time, however, Sedgwick was aware of her cultural bias and tried more than once to take it to task. Her description of the ceremonies in honor of St. Charles in the Duomo of Milan is a case in point. Sedgwick remarks that she and her party could not escape the feeling that they had been witnessing a sort of melodrama. But if the ceremonies in her eyes were not truly Christian, being too showy and pagan-like, the same could be said, she had to admit, of her hasty censure. She tried to place what she had seen in its proper context, and she was bound to acknowledge that, quote, time and use have consecrated these ceremonies to the pious Catholic. To him, each observation of this to us empty and inexpressive show embodies some pious thought or holy memory, unquote. At the very outset of her Italian tour in Turin, Sedgwick notes that, quote, on the very threshold of Italy, we instinctively turn from what is to what was, unquote. And yet, in the rest of the book, she tries to fight that instinct, or at least balance it with a pronounced focus on contemporary matters. And even when the language of aesthetics creeps into her speech, it is made, for the most part, subservient to political and ethical issues. This is especially noticeable in Sedgwick's account of her encounter with Silvio Pellico, undoubtedly the best known of the former prisoners of Spielberg, thanks to the international renown of his book, My Prisons, parts of which Sedgwick had translated into English. While introducing the encounter to her brother as, quote, something that will probably interest you more than all the pictures in Italy, unquote, she cannot help turning Silvio Pellico himself into a picture. Quote, he is of low stature and slightly made, a sort of etching of a man with delicate and symmetrical features, unquote. But then she fleshes him out, as it were, and for the benefit of her American readers, compares him to one of their most influential and most highly respected intellectuals, William Ellery Channing. Pellico, she states, quote, has enough body to gravitate and keep the spirit from its natural upward flight, a more shadowy Dr. Channing, unquote. Aware that to most Americans, Pellico was known primarily as the author of My Prisons, Sedgwick makes him one with his book, a la Whitman. Quote, his looks, his manner, his voice, and every word he spoke were in harmony with his book. Certainly one of the most remarkable productions of our day, unquote. Tellingly, then, the Italian section of Sedgwick's book opens with the portrait of an exemplary Italian. And although she does mention some of the rumors that circulated at the time about Pellico, namely that he had finally succumbed to, quote, political despotism and priestly craft, unquote, Sedgwick dismisses those rumors quite emphatically with the statement that Pellico, quote, is a saint that cannot fall from grace, unquote. Like the exiles in the United States, of whom the Sedgwicks were able to give him news, Pellico embodied the virtues that, in Catherine's view, the best part of the Italian elite possessed. She portrayed him as a human masterpiece, and one perhaps more impressive and precious than those on canvas, walls, or in marble. In men such as Pellico, Confalonieri, Foresti, and the other patriots she knew, Sedgwick saw the possibility of a resurgence of that spirit of independence that she believed had had its heyday in the medieval Italian city-states. Writing at a time when, as Reginald Horseman has shown, Anglo-Saxonism was on the rise in American public discourse, Sedgwick celebrated the days of the Italian city-states as a sort of local equivalent to the Anglo-Saxons' supposedly innate love of liberty. And she suggested that just as her own countrymen had proved to be the true heirs of the Anglo-Saxons in the modern world, so too could Italians reclaim their own glorious heritage. Interestingly, given the ethnic and racial slant of the Anglo-Saxon myth, Sedgwick singled out northern Italians, and the Lombards in particular, as the people who, more than any other, had remained true to their roots and who continued to show a commendable intolerance of despotism. Northerners, in short, were the most American of the Italians. Calling Milan, quote, the queen of the northern Italian republics, Sedgwick recalls the, quote, rising of the people in the 11th century upon the nobles as evidence of the spirit of equal rights hardly surpassed in our democratic age, unquote. And she detects traces of that original fervor when, upon attending a performance at La Scala, she notices how Italian ladies refrained from receiving Austrian officers in their boxes, knowing that if they did, they would be ostracized by their countrymen. Quote, is there not hope of a people who, while their chains are clinking, dare thus openly to disdain their masters? It is true, we see no rational prospect of freedom for Italy, overshadowed as it is by Austrian despotism and overpowered by the presence of her immense military force, and what is still worse, broken into small and hostile states without one federative principle or feeling. But we cannot despair of a people who, like the Milanese, show that they have inherited the spirit of their fathers, unquote. With its appeal to enlightened, heroic founding fathers, the last sentence, it should be noted, echoes a previous passage in which Sedgwick not only emphasizes the affinity between the Italian battle for independence and the American Revolution, but seems to give the Italians an edge over her own countrymen in terms of selflessness and valor. What is more, sounding remarkably like Margaret Fuller, she defines support for the Italian cause as a specific American duty. Quote, we honor our fathers for the few years of difficulty through which they struggled. And can we refuse our homage to these men who sacrificed everything and forever that man holds most dear of freedom and truth? Unquote. Later in the book, while visiting Padua, she once again alludes to a special connection, an affinity between Italy and her own country, and she does so by identifying the Italian tradition of municipal independence as specifically Republican. Moreover, she associates that era of independence with a flourishing of agriculture and the arts in a relation of cause and effect. Quote, The Roman remains and memorials in Lombardy are comparatively few. And it is not to the days of Roman dominion that the mind recurs, but to the period of Italian independence. You perceive in these rich plains of Lombardy the source in nature of the individual life, vigor, and power of the free Italian cities. In these warm plains, completely irrigated and producing without measure corn, wine, and the mulberry tree, those surest natural sources of wealth. And you perceive still in the noble physiognomy of the people the intellectual character that made Italy the seat of art, literature, commerce, and manufactures, while civilization had scarcely dawned on the rest of Europe. These were the days when Milan, Brescia, Verona, Vicenza, and Padua, and all the rest of the glorious company were republics, unquote. In her campaign against despotism and for Italian independence, Sedgwick enlisted, so to speak, some of the artworks she had the opportunity to observe closely in the course of her travels. Indeed, the extent to which certain monuments, pictures, and statues lent themselves to political commentary or seemed to reveal distinctive traits of the Italian character seems to have been one of Sedgwick's main criteria for deeming them worthy of special attention. While several other travelers experienced Italy's artistic heritage mostly as a reminder of an irretrievably lost greatness, Sedgwick looked for clues that might give her and the readers a better understanding of Italy's present situation and some hope for the future. For instance, one of Italy's great masters, now let's see if I can. One of Italy's great masters, Raphael, could be celebrated not only for his genius and exceptional skill, but also for preserving his artistic integrity and creative autonomy, even in the context of papal patronage. Tellingly, after admiring his Sibyls in Rome, Sedgwick paid Raphael what she thought was the highest possible compliment by calling him the Shakespeare of painters, and with almost as full a measure of inspiration, thus using as a yardstick for excellence what many considered the very best of Anglo-Saxon culture. And she found herself riveted by the School of Athens, which she pointed out, quote, was a subject of Raphael's own selection, unquote. What, in her view, made the School of Athens so compelling was that its creator, quote, was unshackled by dictum of pope or cardinal, and freely followed out the suggestion of his inspired genius, unquote. Here was an undisputed which advertised, as it were, the Italian capacity for independent thought, a capacity largely suffocated in the country Sedgwick toured, but which she had reason to believe could re-emerge and finally make Italy one and free. Sedgwick certainly lost no opportunity to denounce the forces of oppression. For instance, after declining to offer any observations on the holdings of Palazzo Madama in Turin, which included works by Dolci, Reni, and Murillo, Sedgwick turned her full attention to the Arch of Peace in Milan. Originally projected by Napoleon, it had been completed by the Austrians after his defeat and death. In the process, it had also been appropriated and turned into a powerful piece of propaganda. To Sedgwick, the ways in which some of the original decorations had been tampered with to remove any allusion to Napoleon served as an example of how art all too often became, quote, the passive slave of tyrants. But what the Austrians had done to the Arch of Peace, rather than proclaiming their might, seemed to Sedgwick to betray their weakness and cowardice. And so did their banishment of a bronze statue by Canova of Napoleon to a cellar of the Brera Gallery. Although she found it failing in resemblance, Sedgwick thought the statue was so lifelike that she described it as buried alive, and capable, even in its present condition, of inspiring terror in the heart of the enemy. Sedgwick's strong response to another piece she saw at the Brera, Guercino's painting of Abraham casting out Hagar and Ishmael, is worth mentioning inasmuch as it seems to encapsulate her personal aesthetic principle. Quote, "The coloring and composition," she writes, "is, as it should always be, made subservient to the moral effect. The outer reveals the inner man," unquote. Similarly, when writing about Titian's Penitent Magdalene, which she saw in Venice, it's now at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, she claims, quote, "It belongs to the highest class of that intellectual painting which reveals the secrets of the soul," unquote. Also of interest are her comments on Leonardo's Last Supper. While noting, as many other visitors had done before her, that parts of the fresco were, quote, "so faded as to be nearly obliterated," unquote, she did not share the common opinion that its countless reproductions were more satisfying than the original. Quote, "No copy that I have seen has approached this face of Jesus, so holy, calm, and beautiful. It is God manifest in the flesh," unquote. But more representative of Sedgwick's attitude and her priority system is the way in which her visit to the studios of two notable living painters, Francesco Hayez and Pelagio Palagi, was completely overshadowed by her glimpse of Confalonieri's house on her way there, a house that, with its inevitable associations, quote, "produce too vivid an impression of our friend's sufferings to allow any pleasant sensations immediately to succeed it," unquote. Sedgwick later visited the Casati Stampa family mausoleum in the little town of Muggio near Monza, and took this opportunity to pay heartfelt homage to the memory of Confalonieri's wife, Teresa Casati, quote, "a victim to Austrian despotism and martyr to conjugal affection," unquote. In doing so, she also addressed anti-Catholic prejudice, which she correctly identified as a formidable obstacle to the full vindication of the Italian character in America. Appealing to her brother Charles, and through him to all her American readers, she emphasized that Teresa Casati's exemplary behavior, quote, "was formed in the bosom of the Catholic Church." In similar accents, she voiced her admiration for Canova's statue of Palamedes, which she saw in the Villa Carlotta at Lake Como. She was particularly struck by the story of how Canova had narrowly escaped being crushed by the accidental fall of the statue, and how his patron, Count Sommariva, had assured him he cherished the damaged statue precisely because it would always remind him of Canova's miraculous preservation. In sharing this anecdote with her readers, Sedgwick pursued a dual purpose. On the one hand, she used it as a strong argument in a rebuttal of widespread negative stereotypes about Italians, and in her passionate defense of their right to self-rule, describing, quote, "a monument of the integrity of the great artist and the delicacy and generosity of his employer," unquote. She exhorted her brother, the ideal reader standing for all readers, to remember that, quote, "these are traits of Italian character